It's not just a story that is being told that's grand, but you have environments you have to create. You have to create ancient Egypt, and you have to create characters that are at different scales throughout the movie.
There's an artistry and a poetry, like, visually to this movie with the CGI elements. It's important to them, as they say, to always try and enhance the story and the performances, never take away from that. And I love the way they talk very poetically. It's like, when you say, tell me how you do it, they go, what? It's hard sometimes to put into words because it's intuitive and it's a feeling. You go, this feels good. It's an emotional response that you have to that world that they've created.
I'd never done a movie at this scale or with this kind of extensive, I mean, the whole movie is really created in CGI, all the visual, all the world is created.
For the actors in the film, I mean myself, it was quite challenging to create what's happening around you, and the specificity of every CGI element around you that's non-existent was challenging, I guess.
Towards me, Nikolai, as much as you can come this way.
I'd done green, blue screen before, but I've never done it to this extent where it's every scene. Of course, you know what they can do. You see these big movies all the time, but to actually be part of it and to get an understanding of just how complicated on a technical level it is to shoot these movies.
You look glorious, Lord. I know.
So there's a lot going on just logistically, but also story-wise. There's just so deep and expansive that it's daunting to begin with. So there's an enormous amount of work in this movie, obviously. And to do it, you need to distribute it to multiple people, multiple artists, and multiple companies that specialize in this. And so we chose, there are two companies here in Australia. One is Allura, who's out of Sydney and Melbourne, and also Rising Sun, who is in Adelaide. They're great companies that have just a number of different things that they do well. Rising Sun is great at environments. They're great at effects work, which is particles and flowing water and things like that, of which there's an enormous amount to that. They were chosen, and they just have a great aesthetic sense as well. And Allura also has a great aesthetic sense and a huge team of artists both here and in Melbourne. And so they do a lot of animation as well. That's one of their specialties, as well as environments and things like that.
That's terrific.
It's a great looking shot.
Yeah, it's going to be a cool shot.
It's going to be a very cool shot. So we were able to funnel a good chunk of the work to those two houses. Then there's Tippett Studio, who's in Berkeley, and they are great animators. They came from a background of stop motion animation, which evolved into computer generated animation. And I love the work that their studio does, because they really understand weight and timing and all of that. So they're doing the Sphinx, and they're doing also the jackal and the falcon fights in the coronation. So they're doing some huge animated sequences in this movie. And then we're also working with Rodeo, who's in Montreal, and Rodeo is great at environments and great at hard surfaces, and they're doing Raw's boat.
At least you know how to keep quiet.
I don't know words for that.
Things would be different if I could dwell amongst my children in the garden of the Nile. It is my burden to fight the demon Apophis night after night. Egypt must never be destroyed by chaos.
Raw's boat was really interesting on the stage side, and also will be extremely interesting on the post-production side. Because the ship is a mirrored surface, and it's reflecting the stars, and it's reflecting Geoffrey Rush and Horace and Beck, it needed to have a surface that actually reflected. So we have a mylar type surface, basically a hard mirrored surface that they can walk on. And you can see the reflection. So if I'm looking at you, I see the reflection of you at the same time, something that's essential. You can't really fake. You need it in place. And it also allowed us to reflect blue screens that were behind there. So you would be totally against blue because it's reflecting the blue screen back there, and I can isolate you and put you in the boat. So Rodeo Effects out of Montreal is building the ship, and the ship travels through this ether, sort of the space ocean, if you can imagine it.
Allow me to fill my flask with these waters.
The waters are not mine.
There's a sequence where Horus goes and gets some of the water of creation to bring it down to Earth. And so that will be interesting in creating that, because there's no water really there, but you want to feel that there's water there. There's a viscosity to the environment as we see it. So it's traveling through space, but it's also traveling through this water. So one of the challenges here is to make it not look like a spaceship, but make it look like it's a vessel on this water type creation of life surface, but in the atmosphere and air.
Is that a storm? There's no clouds.
Scene 52, the burial grounds. This is a scene that has everything in it. You have gods and mortals. You have goddesses on these giant cobras that are chasing our heroes.
I mean, they are enormous, and then all you have is like a tennis ball at the end of the stick, too. So you have to use your imagination.
You have giant structures that crumble in front of everybody. You have fire coming out of the cobra's mouths. Pretty much have everything. So this is a really exciting sequence, and it's been a lot of fun to shoot. We photographed it out in Centennial Park, which is close to the studio here. So it's all exterior lighting. And we built some of the tombs, and then we extend them digitally. And then we have this rig, this gimbal rig that our goddesses are on.
We have a small gimbal happening down in stage 4, which was snake gimbal. It's to recreating the movement of the serpents that Anat and Astarte ride. And so obviously the whole snake is going to be built, in post, in CGI world. But to get the actors having that motion of slithering and sliding on top of the snake, we've got a little motion control gimbal happening there.
And then we take that movement and we tag the animation to it and make it all move together.
So we had serpents, we had fighting, we had running, we had jumping, we had wire work, we had falling pillows. I think we had a kitchen sink somewhere in there, maybe not. But anyway, it was just one of those things on and on and on, and it was really interesting dealing with it because there were so many different elements.
This is a scene that really had to be visualized in utmost detail.
Even though that scene was quite heavily prevised, it still does change and develop as we go along. We have to bear in mind that we do have these huge cobra snakes of size and chasing our characters, and occasionally, you'll put the scene together and then you'll realise, well, look, no, we're missing an action beat from that particular snake or whatever that the fire breathing element that may be involved, which can lengthen the sequence, but then you may have to trim somewhere else. So it's a constant situation of refinement.
We're now 1 week to go before we finish photography, and we're still pre-visualizing some parts of the movie. And it's not really pre-viz now, it's sort of post-viz. And so I guess you could call it, that's a better term for it. So now we're post-vizing scene 52, where now we have more of the live action in place, and we can see the animation of the cobras, we can see how it moves together, and that informs the edit and how it gets put together.
And action.
Trespassers in the house of the king, answer my riddle or cease to be.
The Sphinx is a really interesting character. It's Sphinx as we know it, but it's also Kenneth, our main actor, as the face.
I never was. Am always to be. No one ever saw me, nor ever will. And yet I am the confidence of all who live and breathe. What am I?
So we scanned his face, we put it in there, but we've made it all of sand, and as it moves, it will crumble off, and it will move in really interesting, unique ways.
Wait, I have it! You are tomorrow!
Oh, bother.
So to pull all these characters in is quite a task. I think one of the interesting things with this film is that we get the chance to make a world, our world, and it isn't an accurate ancient Egypt, but it is an ancient Egypt that's really fascinating, and hopefully people will love it.
When you read it on the first script, it's impossible. It just can't be done, and it's very daunting. But once you put your fingers around it, once you wrap your head around it and start to move the pieces, then you can see how it can go and actually be created.
You can start pushing a little bit earlier, I think, if you can get a little bit of a jump on him as he stands.
It wasn't until I saw it just recently that I fully understood what he was going for, and it's quite something.